If you liked the video, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Welcome to Pull My Focus Adventures in the World of Digital Filmmaking, where we bring you the inside tips on making great digital video. And today we're talking color correction part 2, where we talk about curves, color grades, and LUTs. Now this video here is sort of a part 2 of the color correction video that we did back in February of 2018 called Color Correction Made Easy Step by Step. So I'm going to assume that you've watched that video. Please, if you didn't watch that video, please go and watch that video, because a lot of things I'm going to talk about here is going to be already answered in that video. So that'll make things a little easier. This is part 2. This is more advanced. This is doing a little more work. But if you're watching this video and you've watched the other one, you're ready for this kind of work. One thing I want to mention about color correction and color grading is that color correction is mostly objective, meaning there's mostly a way that everyone agrees on it being done, okay? The objectivity comes in the form of white balance, where you basically want white to look like white on your videos, and skin tones, where you basically want humans to look healthy and normal in your videos, all right? Color grading is more subjective, meaning it really depends on the mood of your video, the tone you want to set, the emotion, the feeling. The grade of your video is going to reflect a lot of those things. That's really up to you. Of course, you want to have your color correction first, then you're going to talk about grade. So let's get into more of the Lumetri panel here in Premiere Pro, so you can see how to take even more control over your color. First thing you want to do, like always, is go into your color profile so that you know what I'm doing. So you can go up to Window, Workspaces, and choose Color to get into your color workspace that's defined by Premiere. That should bring you in a screen that looks similar to mine. Of course, your footage will be different. And what I'm going to do is, since my Lumetri scopes exist here, I'm going to bring my effect controls. I'm going to be using them a little bit. I'm going to pull my effect controls down to here, to this bar here, so that it can exist underneath my Lumetri panel. You should have access to your Lumetri controls, and you should have access to your scopes. And my 3 favorite scopes are here right now. It is the Luma scope, the RGB Parade, and the vector scope. All right. These are the things that I use a lot when I'm doing my color correction. These are the things I rely on. All right. So in the previous video, color correction step by step, made easy, we used 2 of the controls here in the Lumetri panel. We used the basic correction, and we used a little bit of creative, and we used the fast color corrector, which was a plugin which is an effect in the effects bin, so that we could fix skin tone. This time what we're going to do is we're going to go into curves. We're going to use basic creative curves. We might dip into a little bit of the color wheels and match, and we'll get rid of the fast color corrector. So we'll show you how to do the skin tone correction without using the fast color corrector. So let's look at curves. Underneath the curves panel, if you click the curves, you'll see 2 different selections here. One for RGB curves, which is this. And the RGB curves exist as, it looks like a straight line. It's basically a curve with only 2 points, which is a straight line. But it can be, we can add points and make it a curve. That's why they call them curves. This is the Luma curve, or the luminosity curve, luminescence, luminosity. And then you have red, green, and blue, which all can be independently controlled. All right. This little check mark here, let's turn the effect on and off in case you want to see what you're working on and what it looked like before you worked on it. And here are the hue saturation curves, this is where the magic happens. These are going to be a lot of fun to play with. Hue versus saturation, hue versus hue, hue versus Luma, Luma versus saturation, and saturation versus saturation. And the other panel, which we'll touch on really quickly, is color wheels and match, where you can set tones in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. Curves are pretty straightforward. And if you've ever used Photoshop, you've ever used curves in Photoshops, you'll understand this the same way. So the intensity goes from bottom to top, and notice how this line is a straight line, okay? And this is the luminosity or luminous or Luma curve, okay? Now, if I grab the bottom of it, now take a look at this. Actually, let's get something better. Let's get something that has, good, this is raw. So this is Courtney playing Lady Luck, one of my favorite sketches that we've ever done. And notice, I'm going to zoom into this. Notice that the black information on the Luma scale is way above the 0. Now, last time when we worked with the basic correction, we grabbed the black level and we brought the black level down so that the information hit the bottom of the scale. I'm going to clamp the signal so that it stops at the bottom of the scale. So we did this with the black level. We're not going to use these levels now. We're going to use everything. We're going to do curves. Okay, so in this case, if I want to bring the black levels down, I'm going to grab the bottom of this Luma curve and I'm going to slowly drag it to the right, which is, notice, it's bringing the black level down on my Luma parade. Oh, sorry, on my Luma scope. So my Luma scope now reads the black level is down at 0. Okay, so that's how you set the blacks on the curves. Same way you set the white levels, the high levels. You grab that top mark and then you drag it to the left, which increases that spread. All right. Now, one quick thing we must say about setting blacks and white levels, it's very contextual. If you have an image that has no solid black in it, it might not make sense to bring whatever is slightly dark all the way down to 0. And adversely, if you have an image that has no blaring white things in it, if there's like pieces of paper or whatever in the shot, it doesn't make sense to drag the intensity all the way up so that the piece of paper reaches 100 IRE. It's always contextual, peeps. So we use white cards, white balance cards, and stuff like that to help, but use your eye in that case. Make sure that what you're making super white is supposed to be super white. Anyway, so I basically set my highlights and my blacks down there, all right? The curve can come into, and you've probably seen this before, where they set a little S contrast curve. Well, that's similar to using the contrast here, if I use contrast here. In fact, what I want to do is show you guys a method that I use sometimes. I'll take the saturation, bring it all the way down. Because the first thing I want to do is work on that contrast. I want to get the contrast to be dialed in the way I want. I can do that best without any color information in front of me. So if there's no color information there, now when I go to my curves, I can really see what my contrast looks like. So I'm going to set a mark right in the middle, right smack dead in the middle. I just do that just by clicking. Okay, and now I'm going to set a mark halfway through the top and halfway to the bottom. I basically defined my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights. Okay, highlights would be more way up here, so to speak, and shadows might be a little deeper. But basically what I'm doing is I'm replicating these controls in the basic correction just by using curves. And when I want to set my contrast, this is a typical thing you see a lot where it's an S curve. So I'm going to bring the highlights up a little bit, and I'm going to dip the shadows down a little, and notice how much contrast I have now. Her hair really stands out from her skin tone, and her skin really stands out from the background. All right, so let's bring the color information back in. I'm going to just double click on the saturation, and now we've gone from this to this just by setting the luminosity, the Luma curve. That's it. And we're not done yet, but typically what you'll see is you'll see a curve or something on the Luma, but you won't really do too much with the RGB. And sometimes what you will do with the RGB is you would try and set your white balance. And if you don't have a white balance reference, what some people do is they'll look at something in the shot that's white, and they will, this is a bad example, but they will make the R, the G, and the B equal in the RGB parade. I don't typically like that approach, but it's a really good last resort if you haven't used color reference cards or anything like these. Remember I showed you guys these things? Really cheap on Amazon. If you haven't used any of that, then find something that's in the image that's white and manually set your RGB, which I can do here, to so that they are equal to each other on this panel. And that can pretty much dial in your white balance. But I would generally say use this auto white balance, this white balance selector. It's so easy. It's so easy to use. Just click it and pick it, and you're done. All right. Check the other video for more details on that. So those are RGB curves. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. That's all I'm going to touch on right now about the RGB curves. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. The nitty-gritty being the hue saturation curves. Now we want to run down these things pretty quick, but this is where a lot of the magic happens in your correction and in your grading. Now the way they work is there's thing 1 and thing 2. And thing 1 is what we're identifying, what range of thing 1 we're identifying that we're going to use to affect thing 2. It's really easy to see. It's a little difficult to explain. Let's take the example of hue versus saturation first, and then I'll show you some neat things about this, this graph. If I grab the line here with the mouse and I drag this all the way down to the bottom, notice that the saturation pretty much disappears. Okay, and if I drag it all the way up to the top, it's super oversaturated. Okay, so what I'm saying is right now, all of the hue, every hue in this image increases saturation in it. Okay, a couple of things about these tools that you're going to see in here. If you double click on that, it resets the entire thing. Okay, so if I went and I did a bunch of neat stuff and blah, 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 and I want to start over, double click. If you have a bunch of points and you want to get rid of one, hover over that point. On the Mac, you're going to hold down the Command key, and on the PC, you're going to hold down the key that I'm showing you right now because I don't use a PC. And you can remove points that way. The intensity increases from the bottom to the top of the graph. So as you can see, the intensity of saturation is 0 up to, wow, 100 or whatever. There's usually a slider at the bottom. A lot of people miss this. There's a slider here at the bottom of the graph. And that's so that when you select a range, you don't get stuck. So if I wanted to select a range from, say, from here to that to in the right direction, well, how do I do that? If I click here, then I'm selecting this entire range. The way it works is I can select this and I can scroll this way and select that. Basically, it's a rotating circle. It's an endless circle, but they're showing it in a straight line. So this can move around that way. Curves start in the middle, generally speaking, but they can be moved up and down, as you can see. You'll see the intensity of the effect with the line that shows up once you click. If you look really close, the line gets less saturated at the bottom and gets more saturated at the top. And if I move the line around, it changes color. So this is kind of a graphical representation of what's going to happen when you drop that point. And finally, holding the Shift key limits the movement to a vertical movement. To vertical movement. So if I hold the Shift key, I'm limited only to up and down. If I let go of the Shift key, I can move all around. So hue versus saturation, that's easy. First one, we choose a hue or hue range, and then we can affect how saturated that range is. So for example, our first example was everything, right? Or if I choose the eyedropper here, and I click on this can, notice how it shows a range right here. The middle point is the point I clicked, and then it feathers out to these points in the hue line. And if you notice, if I pull this down, the saturation of that can, the colors in that can disappears till now it's like there's no saturation in it. And if I drag it up, it gets much hotter, much, much hotter. The saturation goes up, all right? And if I want, I can drag the range out a little bit, which will affect more colors outside of its range, or I can drag it in, which will affect fewer colors. So hue versus saturation is pretty neat in increasing the saturation of a particular hue. Hue versus hue is where we get into skin tone. This is where we can get rid of the fast color corrector now. Hue versus hue, if I don't make a bunch of points on hue versus hue, right? Then I'm dragging the entire spectrum. This is where I'm kind of dialing in the hue. I'm rotating the hue around the image information, okay? Which is exactly what, notice the vector scope is rotating. It's rotating, which is exactly what we want to do to fix skin tone. Once again, I can use my mask, okay? And I got a mask here already set, and I can drag this mask over, say, Aries face, and the vector scope says the skin tone is correct because we shot it with correct skin tone. Our lights are pretty honed in onto our cameras and everything. But let's say if it was wrong, then I'm going to go to hue versus hue. And this is instead of using fast color corrector, I'm going to hue versus hue, and I'm going to dial it in. Notice I can rotate her skin tone around that line. And I can give her a little more red if I want. Okay? And then if I turn off that mask, my skin tone is correct. Next up, hue versus luma. Now, this is where we can control the luminosity of a particular hue, how bright a particular hue in the image is. So once again, let's use this cocktail here that Frankie Boy shot. All right. And I'm going to choose the flower. I'm going to use my eyedropper tool, click on the flower here. And the eyedropper tool just gave me this range. Okay. If I just take this range and I drag it up, it's making it brighter. Just that hue. If I drag it down, it's making it darker. And you can use this in places not only like here, but if we go back to Ari and Gabriel, I can maybe make her blouse brighter by clicking on the eyedropper, grabbing that, and then boosting the brightness of the blouse. And I can make it just kind of crazy. Or I can dip it all the way down to there. See that? So hue versus luma allows you to change the luma scale of a particular hue. Now it's time for luma versus saturation. This one could be a little tricky, so stick with me. This one is basically, this controls the saturation level based on the luminosity of the image. For example, the luminosity is the determining factor for what stays saturated, okay? So I'll show you exactly what this means. Now, if I just grab this line, we have this nice little mountain scene, okay? And you know what? I'm going to go ahead, just for example, and go to basic correction and really jack this saturation level up. So I bumped this saturation level up to 200, okay? I think that was log footage anyway, so it was really low. Going back to curves, we're going to go to luma versus saturation. And I'm going to take this line and bring it all the way down. Bang. Which means anything that is above this level of luminosity loses its saturation. Saturation comes all the way down. Now watch this. If I just make this point like dead in the middle and I make a new point and I slowly bring, now I'm saying anything that's at this luminosity or below, okay, gets its saturation back. Notice what a creepy effect that is now. So now the mountains and the trees get their saturation back, but anything that falls above the mountains and the trees, right, this level here, stays with zero saturation, which is a really creepy effect. Notice if I move this out, I get it back, but if I bring this down, right, and if I start to bring it all the way over, everything starts to lose the saturation. But right from here, the sky has lost its saturation completely, but the grass has. And this can give you a really super creepy, like outer world effect or dreamy effect. So here's an example of saturation versus saturation. That means I can choose a saturation and then affect how saturated that saturation is. Okay, let's just take a look real quick. So if her lipstick and her dress is way oversaturated, now if I just drag this up, I'm increasing the saturation. If I drag it down, I'm decreasing the saturation. But if I choose the lipstick color and I drag it up, I'm increasing the saturation on only the lipstick saturation, and I'm lowering the saturation only on the lipstick saturation. And an example of using this is if I want to boost the saturation but not boost the saturation of just the lips, I can come in here, or the dress, I can come in here, I can choose the dress, I can lower the saturation on the dress a little, and then go up to basic correction, increase the saturation of the entire image where I'm not increasing the lipstick anymore. One way you can get away with something like this is with vibrance. So a lot of these tools can be cross-used, but that's an example of using saturation versus saturation. I hope that was helpful in the hue saturation curves. And now let's talk about a little bit about color grading and LUTs. Looks are visible stylizations of an image or a video with intent to create a clear mood. Okay, so when you're talking about grading and LUTs, you're talking about emotion, you're talking about feeling, you're talking about a specific idea that is more subjective, like we said earlier. Okay, so once color correction is done, then we can start talking about looks, lookup tables, which all falls underneath color grading. All right, now one thing I'm going to have you do is, when you're working with either basic correction, creative, or curves to correct your video, don't drift into the world of color grading just yet. In fact, I specifically will do basic corrections, skin tone, and white balance, and then create another Lumetri effect on my footage. So my first bit of footage, like say here, will have all my color corrections and everything. Okay. We'll lose that and have a Lumetri that's basically just for correction. And if you want, you can right-click it and rename it to color corrections. And that's now called Lumetri color corrections. And I'm going to go over here to my effects and grab a new Lumetri, which is generally all the way down at the bottom in color correction. Grab a new one and drag it onto my footage and call this one, rename to say grading. In lieu of something like DaVinci Resolve, which keeps versions of all the things you do and you work with nodes and everything, this is what I find is the best way to do it in Premiere, where I keep everything separate so that if I need to go back, if I need to wipe out my color grade completely because my client didn't like it, or we woke up one morning and said that looks terrible, we don't have to redo all the color corrections. Okay, so all your curves and all that stuff for corrections, keep in one Lumetri and then grade on the next one. Here's some advice for doing color grades. Number one, like we said, it's very emotional, very subjective. And I always use that example of the Matrix, where in the Matrix world, in the computer world, it was very green CRT-ish tones, and in the real world, it was bluish tones and more cool tones, like human tones. Use grading where it makes sense, okay? A lot of people like to throw around the idea of orange and teal, orange and teal, orange and teal. Why orange and teal? Well, number one, orange and teal on the color wheel, orange and teal are complementary of each other because they sit on the opposite sides. They also lend themselves better to skin tones. So let's take an example, okay? So if we're here, and once again, we're on the mountains, this is a good example of a place where you could use orange and teal, okay? Because we have, for here, and what I'm gonna do is go to color wheels and match, And matching is color matching, which we'll go into a completely different video. But for orange and teal, you want to move blues into the shadows. And I'm going to use this wheel here and drag this over to the bluish area. Okay. I'm going to drag it way over, make it really extreme to make it very blue. And the midtones, I'm going to put into the oranges area. So I'm going to drag it up, make it very, very different. Okay. So this is before, this is after. Before, after. And one thing it does is it kind of simulates the golden hour, you know, the time of the 2 times of the day where the sun is like sitting in the right spot in the sky, which is kind of early in the morning or later in the afternoon. It gives warmth to the image. It makes the image feel kind of nice. Orange and teal is something you can use as a look that you can use in your arsenal, but it has to make sense. Okay, I can use orange and teal here where Audrey is sitting on the bench, which I've actually done. So that's with it on, that's with it off. It just warms the image up a little bit. But if I'm doing an interview with a person, I'm not necessarily going to throw orange and teal into this situation. Firstly, because there aren't really any natural shadows here. I mean, her shirt is dark, but I don't want to inject blue, teal into her shirt, and making her more orange is going to make her look like an alien. So use wisely your orange and teal ideas. The other thing I want to say is if someone tells you just grab some LUTs and throw them on, let's be careful about that. First things first, if you're in Premiere, I suggest just go look at the looks that's already there. Go to Creative tab. You can find under Creative, Look. And there are all these looks you can play with. And I can walk through them and assign them. Okay. And these are basically just recipes for contrast and color tones, and they're just basically recipes for different ways that your video can look. One question you might ask yourself is under the basic correction zone, you'll see something called the input LUT. And an input LUT in this case is a lookup table that's predefined for a certain camera or certain type of footage. For example, we did a shoot for a web series called Riding with Cars, and we didn't shoot it. In fact, I wasn't even on set. Frank was the assistant director and helped with the production, but he didn't shoot it either. It was shot by another cameraman who used a Blackmagic Ursa Mini camera. And when they delivered the footage, they also gave us an input LUT. So that's what that's for. When I bring in the footage here, okay, and it's flat and it's whatever, and then I'm going to choose from input LUT. I'm going to either choose it from the list, or if it's not in the list, I can go browse, and here's the LUT that he gave me, and open it. And notice how it changed the look a little bit. I think it's meant for Rec 709 delivery, which is what most like consumer grade cameras and HD video is set for. And that's just a way for me to have a starting point before I start to color grade. So that's what input LUT is for. Some people use input LUT for a look. You can. It's not necessarily the way it's supposed to be used, but you can do that. If you just want to search for looks, I go into Creative and choose a look from the Creative tab. And finally, some people, you'll ask them, do you ever use LUTs? They go, no, I don't use LUTs. LUTs are terrible, blah, blah, blah. Well, predefined LUTs may not be right for you. What I suggest you do is create your own looks, create your own moods and ideas, and then once you get good at it, go check out some LUTs from different places. I mean, some of them aren't terrible. A lot of them are terrible, but some of them are great. There are a lot of terrific LUTs available on FilmRight's Triune store. If you go buy one of those or two of those, you'll see how they do things. Get yourself familiar with contrast. Get yourself familiar with warmth and balance and stuff and things like that. And then LUTs, they're just basically a tool. You don't never have anybody just grab the footage and then slap on a LUT and you're done. That's not the way you want to roll. You want to be able to create your own. You want to be able to mix and match your own. You want to bring one in and then change it around, right? I'll come here and I go, boom, there's a look, and then I can start to mess with it because I know how to use my curves now. I know how to use my saturation. I know how to use my hue versus hue. I know how to use all these tools so I can get even closer to the look that I want. So hopefully that helped you out a little bit. This color correction section 2, where you're going to do a little more work, but you can notice that you get a lot more control from using curves and using color wheels. So, and then using looks sparingly when they need to be used. Thanks for watching. Make sure to check out pullmyfocus.tv for the companion articles that go along with these videos. Once again, we'll see you in the next one. Do 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 do.